Why does the United States Congress refuse to take up an issue of securing our border while spending inordinate amount of time focused on sending money to Ukraine or to Israel or to Taiwan, all kinds of places, it seems, except for the border? It's really a puzzling situation. We're going to see why. And we've got somebody we've had on before, a great guy to help break this down, Dan Caldwell, who is currently the public policy director, advisor, at Defense Priorities. He's now on board our team over there at Defense Priorities, as well as a former combat Marine and a former congressional aide. Welcome back to the show, Dan.
Danny, it's always great to be on. Thank you for having me.
Certainly my pleasure. We're always great to have your insights because you're so well connected here in D.C. And we're going to really count on your analysis and knowledge both of the political side as well as the foreign policy and military side, which is one of the great reasons because you got both those hats on. Here's one of the things that we find very puzzling over here, and a lot of our folks who are watching also do, is that when you look at what's on the legit legislative table, everybody says that the issue on our border is important. We're going to get to that in a second. But then they see that there's nothing in the border actually in. In fact, back in February, on behalf of President Biden, the Senate, Chuck Schumer, said they passed a bill that had a lot of money for Ukraine, for Israel, Taiwan, and a few other things here, but nothing for the border, nor was it even mentioned. Here's how he put it back then.
Today, we witnessed one of the most historic and consequential bills to have ever passed the Senate. It's certainly been years, perhaps decades, since the Senate passed a bill that so greatly impacts not just our national security, not just the security of our allies, but the security of Western democracy.
That's such grandiose flair of rhetoric there about how important it is. And one wonders why at least the border part wouldn't be included. And before we go too much further, I wonder if you can say, some kind of what's going on the Capitol Hill, why that's not at least included in the package.
Yeah. So if you go back to the beginning of this year and really end of last year, is that the new House Speaker, Speaker Johnson, and other Republicans, including some in the Senate, said that they ultimately would not move forward any new aid to Ukraine unless it was tied to provisions that would ultimately provide more border security. And it took a couple months, but a package did come together in the Senate that did have some border security provisions. They were negotiated by Senator Lankford, and they were tied to provisions to provide more aid to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. However, Senate Republicans and House Republicans in particular, the majority of the Senate Republican caucus, and then almost all House Republicans felt the border provisions were too weak, and that essentially they didn't accomplish what those driving the legislation said it would. And so what happened is that Senator Schumer and Senator McConnell came together after it became clear that the bill that had the border provisions wouldn't pass. They introduced a clean defense supplemental that would just provide aid to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan as well too, and then some stuff to support operations ongoing in the Red Sea, in the Middle East, and a few other things to help beef up the defense industrial base. So they passed that bill in the Senate, and it didn't go anywhere in the House for a couple months. However, over the last couple days, Speaker Johnson has introduced a series of bills that essentially would fund all the things that that clean Senate bill would fund. So Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, and things for the defense industrial base, along with some other issues like around banning TikTok, and I think a particularly bad piece of legislation called the Repo Act, which would allow the United States to take control of frozen Russian assets and then give it to Ukraine. So that is what the current bills that really just the last hour or so, they've actually become live. You can read them. I was going through them a bit before the show, and none of it has anything to do related to the American border. Now, look, you can, regardless of what you think about the immigration issue, if you look at the polling, it is a top priority for most Americans. Now, many Americans probably have some disagreements about how strict immigration policy should be, and I think that's a reasonable debate to have. But most Americans believe that the primary function of any government is to provide border security. And there is, again, this isn't just a Republican issue. There is pretty bipartisan agreement among voters, maybe not necessarily here in Washington, D.C., is that the government needs to do a better job of providing border security. But Washington has prioritized these foreign aid bills over addressing that issue, which I admit on many levels is very complicated. So they're going to do what they think is the easy thing and focus abroad.
I wish they would be doing the hard right thing as opposed to the easy thing, but that's perhaps mythical thinking here. But let me actually show you a piece of what Johnson's saying about this. I believe it was yesterday, where his view is.
We just had a policy conference with all the House Republicans. We laid out the plan on how to finally address the supplemental situation. There are precipitating events around the globe that we're all watching very carefully, and we know that the world is watching us to see how we react. We have terrorists and tyrants and terrible leaders around the world like Putin and Xi and in Iran, and they're watching to see if America will stand up for its allies and in our own interest around the globe, and we will.
Now, according to some interest, even though these things are now live bills and there's a lot of similarities between the House and the Senate versions, even though one is one clean one, the other one's the shorter one. But according to an analyst on MSNBC, it's not sure that Johnson can get this passed, or that if it does, if it's going to work in the Senate. So even though they're not focusing on American national security, it's not clear they're going to get any of these passed.
Yeah, it is by no means guaranteed that all these bills will pass the House and then that the Senate will take them up in one form. And so this is where it kind of it's interesting is that the plan, as I understand it, and again, things are literally changing hour to hour, but my understanding is that what the House is planning to do is pass all four of these bills and then use a procedural mechanisms where they essentially package the four bills into one and then send it back to the Senate. But for a variety of reasons, because of politics in the Senate, candidly increasing concern about funding Israel coming from the Democrats on the left, that it is not clear that even if these bills pass the House, the Senate will take them up. That is why there is an effort by the Democrats in the House and by a couple Republicans, one who actually is left, Ken Buck, to use what is called a discharge petition, which would force Speaker Johnson, essentially would force his hand, and the bill that the Senate passed would have to be brought up on the floor regardless of what Speaker Johnson wants. A discharge petition is rarely used successfully. The last time it was used successfully was in 2015 when then Representative Jeb Hensarling would not move an export-import bill out of his committee, so the discharge petition was used to ultimately move that. You could see that happen here. There's been Republicans, of course, anonymously on background, going to the press saying, if it looks like these foreign aid bills are going to fail, then I am just going to sign the discharge petition. And there's probably enough votes in the House to pass the Senate bill, unfortunately, at this moment. So that is how things are looking. And just to be clear, unless discharge petition, again, is very complicated procedural mechanism. There's a lot of ways that you could actually undermine it. My understanding is if they pass the Senate bill, at that point, it would just go to the president unless there's some types of amendments or things like that. So again,
what is the prospects that all four of the bills would pass in the House if he did bring them up anyway? Will they all four pass?
That really remains to be seen. There is a lot of Republican opposition, including from some more establishment moderate members. I do think that if the rule governing debate over the bill ultimately passes, if the rule is not taken down, and that's a real thing that could happen. So before every bill is voted on, there's something called a rule that sets the parameters of the debate and how many amendments are allowed to be voted on. there's an effort afoot to take down the rule, because usually what happens is regardless of whether or not a Democrat or Republican supports a bill, they vote with their party against the rule. It's kind of tradition, but what you've seen the last year and a half is more and more Republicans voting with Democrats to take down the rule, and they essentially kill the bill that way. That could happen with any number of these bills, particularly if the Democrats think that they can get the Senate passed bill out via discharge position. So you could have this thing not even go to a full debate and vote, is that it could just be killed on the rule. So I know that's not exactly a very clear, decisive answer, but it's really hard to overstate how currently fluid things are.
Yeah.
Regarding,
I get it. Yeah. There is no easy, clear answer, or I don't think they even have one up there. I want to take a look though at the mostly right now at the Ukraine portion of this, because that's even more than the Israel part. It seems to get a lot of emotion and a lot of debates going on. So I want to take a look at that. First of all, I think as everybody knows, Zelensky is really keen on having this pass.
We have almost no artillery remaining.
Last month, you said if we have American support, we will win. If we don't have American support, we will lose.
It's true.
Richard Haass of the Council on Foreign Relations seems to agree with Zelensky.
I don't much care whether it's a combined bill or a separate bill, so long as the aid for Ukraine passes. That's the most pressing of all of that.
Right.
And every day the battlefield news, Joe, is awful strategically, but also in human terms. The idea that you have these soldiers on the front lines who simply maybe have a half dozen shells and they have to parcel them out to get through a day. You can't fight a war that way, and it's tilting in Russia's favor. This is recklessness and irresponsibility on steroids that we've ever reached this point. I'm hoping, and again, to me, it doesn't matter so much whether it's loans or grants. Just get Ukraine the military aid.
Now, he's kind of playing into something here that is really common among those who are emphatically supportive, like Schumer, about getting this money to Ukraine by claiming that it's going to have a decisive impact on the battlefield, et cetera. And yet, when you look at now, you may have seen more that has come out since I saw this last. But you and I were earlier talking about what's in some of that bill, and as you'll see there on the top side, number one, the bill is only looking at $48 billion instead of $60, which was originally coming in. But as you can see in those red underline areas there, that a good chunk of that is going to replenish DoD stocks. Another $14 billion is going for the DoD operations in the European area of operation, and only $13.8 billion is directly for stuff to go to Ukraine. I think you've told me that some of that top category could also end up there, but there's only one that seems to be going directly to it. So it's not going to matter that much in terms of how many weapons are actually going to be, or ammunition is going to go in. It's not going to reverse the situation in manpower, in artillery over the theater, and in air defense missiles. So if it's not going to change that, why is everyone so excited about doing this like it's going to make a difference?
Because our policymaking class, with some notable exceptions, is absolutely delusional about the state of American power. They refuse to recognize that we have real constraints on our ability to do everything we're trying to do around the world. Really, right now, foreign policy is a math problem. And J.D. Vance actually had a really great New York Times piece earlier this week about how our Ukraine policy is a math problem. We simply do not have enough weapons, regardless of whether or not the money is there or not, to send Ukraine. Our defense industrial base is not producing enough to just sustain Ukraine, much less Israel and Taiwan. It is a mathematical reality. And you can't wish that away. You can't will that away. It is a real constraint. And what really angers me about this is that whether it's somebody like Richard Haass, who should know better, this is a guy who spent decades in the State Department at the highest levels of policymaking, ran the Council on Foreign Relations. He knows this. And Richard Haass likes to play this game where he kind of talks out of both sides of his mouth. He was involved potentially in some back channel diplomatic efforts. He got blown up over that. Now he seems to have returned to the hawkish side of it. But all people like him should know better. A lot of politicians just choose to be disconnected from this and choose to be delusional. So it's not great. But it really infuriates me when you have folks that know this is a real problem pretending it's not. And I'd also just say this about the money and how it's broken out, is that there's a really dishonest bit of messaging going on here about what this money is actually for. Is they're saying that the bulk of the money is for replenishment of DoD stockpiles. That money is tied to what is called presidential drawdown authority. So what it is doing is giving the president the ability to draw down a certain amount of equipment and ammunition from Department of Defense stocks and send it to Ukraine. So we're essentially funding Ukraine primarily two ways. There's also some other ways we can talk about, where you're giving money directly to Ukraine that they then turn around and buy arms and ammunition from American defense contractors. And then we're sending stuff directly from Defense Department stocks, and then they get money to buy from defense contractors as well too. But here's the thing, is that you send, say, 100 Javelin missiles to Ukraine. It's not like next week the Amazon truck's going to show up with 100 new missiles.
Right.
Already 2, 3, 4, or 5 years backlogged in terms of orders across our arsenal.
Wow.
And so the reality is that a small amount of artillery ammunition, anti-air missiles, anti-tank missiles are coming off the production lines. They're maybe in some cases not actually entering a DoD, ammo supply point. They're just going right on a plane over to Ukraine, and then DoD is turning around and placing an order, which will take years to fill. So there is not a huge stockpile of ammo sitting in Hampton Roads or the Port of Los Angeles or wherever, waiting for Congress to pass the bill. It's really going to be small amounts that, maybe on some level could help Ukraine in the short term, but it's not going to fundamentally change the situation on the ground and the fact that Ukraine can't win a decisive victory. And it's certainly not going to make the United States more safe and secure.
And Dan, here's one of the other odd factors involved here. There's all this focus on, oh my God, we have to get this bill passed, or it's Congress's fault if Ukraine loses. People have been almost directly saying that, and yet what seems to get actually no thought whatsoever is that there is quietly a move that the Czech Republic is going on right now. And earlier today, they announced they actually have found another line on a couple hundred thousand more artillery shells, now up to 1.5 million shells that their premier says that they can provide. So already there's way, way more than we would ever provide by this bill. And no one's talking about how this move by the Czech is not going to change the dynamics on the ground with 1.5 million when probably maybe a couple 100,000. I don't know the exact number that could be released out of here, if it's even that much. But there is just,
I don't think it's that much
between reality and what's going on the ground.
Well, look, the Europeans should be the ones stepping up here. This is a war in their backyard or their front yard, whatever you want to call it. What happens in Ukraine matters more to Europe than it does to the United States. And there's been a lot of talk lately about, well, Europe is now contributing more. Well, a lot of times people are being dishonest about that because they're counting pledges. And you and I both know the Europeans, particularly the Germans, have a history of pledging something and then not following through with it. But even if it were true, it's like, well, the Europeans are spending more, good, but that doesn't mean the United States should then spend more. They are the ones that should primarily, if not entirely, be bearing the brunt of supplying Ukraine. And they could be doing a lot more if they wanted to. They could be spending more money. They could be expanding their defense industrial base faster. They could be, say, rolling back parts of the welfare state to free up resources to enhance their own security. But they're choosing not to because they know that at the end of the day, with Biden in charge, is that Uncle Sam will continue to be Uncle Sucker in Europe. And that is an unfortunate reality. The only way you're going to get Europeans to step up more is by the United States doing less and consistently doing less.
And there's another reason, a factor behind that too, for the reticence on the part of the Europeans, because they know that they're not at risk, not really, from a conventional Russian attack. We actually had a former British diplomat on yesterday who has just written a book after he resigned from 25, I think, years in service after having served in Moscow for a lot of those years. And he just tells us unequivocally that behind the scenes, these nations know that Putin doesn't have the capacity to threaten anybody there. So they're not going to cut back on social programs, which will cause domestic political problems for them when they know that there's really not a big issue. And as you say, Uncle Sugar will keep coming through.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know our friend Ben Friedman talks about this a lot. Is a lot of the Europeans in their behavior over the last 20 years has demonstrated that they don't view the Russians as a major threat. And if you look at the Russian capacity, well, let me back up. They do view it as a threat, but not as a threat that the Red Army could roll into Warsaw, Berlin, or Paris. They don't believe that. And on the capacity side they likely don't have they don't have the ability to do that. They've taken tremendous losses in Ukraine. They have their own constraints. And all we have to be honest as well too is, despite what people say about Putin, is he has not talked the same way, say, about the Baltics or about Poland or about other satellite states. Like he has not expressed the same territorial ambitions that he did in Ukraine for other parts of the former Soviet Union. So that's a key point. I'd also just say this too about what the Europeans are doing. It is incredibly duplicitous because, as you know, look at their own behavior. But what are they doing here in the United States? Is their diplomats and think tanks they support with their own governmental budgets are inflating the threat of Russia because they want the United States to stay in Europe, to continue to provide security umbrella. So you have organizations like, say, the Atlantic Council, who take a lot of money from European, both Eastern, Western European. They take money from NATO. That is all part of a strategy of the Europeans to keep us enmeshed in Europe and continuing to subsidize their defense. And you know what? In some ways, I don't blame them. I blame us for being Uncle Sucker.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree with that. So in the last few minutes we have here, you've already talked about it. It's so fluid and volatile up on the Hill. It's hard to predict anything. But if you had to give me your best guess, do you think that at least any time in the near future that there's going to be the House is going to vote on whether it's independent for Ukraine security or if it's all four of those bills, and then that it will be passed by the Senate and then gone to the White House? How likely do you think that's going to be? Do you think they're going to get something, or do you think it might founder and they might not get anything in the near term?
So I say this as somebody who's been pretty open about the fact that I don't think there should be more American aid to Ukraine, again, because it's primarily a European security problem. I do think that you could get a very ugly win for the Ukraine Hawks where they do pass some form of more aid to Ukraine. However, I think that this will be the last Ukraine aid bill. I really do. It doesn't. The political support has collapsed. You still have the left. Even people like AOC and Bernie Sanders united in their support for Ukraine, but there's cracks starting to show there. The majority of Republicans don't want more aid to Ukraine. And I think that you combine that with the fact that, look, there are real constraints on our power, is that I think this is the last significant aid package that gets through. And it's going to be an ugly win if it does get through for the Ukraine side.
It's exactly the same way I see it as well. All right. Well, listen, Dan, thanks so much for coming on and providing some clarity on some of this. And we really appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you.
And thank you guys for coming on today. We have another show actually coming up in about 30 minutes. We have Jason Beardsley, and he's going to talk about some other issues related to what's actually going on the ground on the military side. And as always, he's very entertaining and very knowledgeable. So come back and join us again in about 30 minutes for Daniel Davis Deep Dive.